Welcome to the webinar on Autism Introduction. My name is Evgenia Generalova and I'm Knowledge and Communication Manager for Child Hub based in Pterodazom's regional office in Budapest. And I would like to give you a very brief overview of the platform in case it's the first time you're using Adobe Connect for webinars. So please pay attention that we cannot hear you. You can only communicate with the presenters using the chat. Please feel free to use it to ask questions or write your comments. In case you have any problems hearing us, make sure that your microphone icon, speaker's icon, is green. You can find it on the top black bar. Please pay attention to the polls. We will have a few during the webinars. And also there is an icon of a man with a raised hand on the black bar next to your speaker's icon. Please feel free to use it to show your emotions and suggestions. And now I will put the presentation and give floor to our speakers, Irene and Maya. And there is also a poll our presenters would like you to answer. If you could please pay attention to it for a minute. And now, Irene, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Irene. We can hear you.
Okay. We'd like you, first of all, just a small introduction to myself and Maya. I'm Irene Stevens from Scotland. I work partly for the National Autistic Society as a team leader. I also work for the Centre of Excellence for Looked After Children in Strathclyde in Glasgow, which is a university. And I was also Director of Care for a large autism-specific residential school in the UK, the first autism-specific residential school in Scotland. I'll introduce Maya. Maya, would you like to introduce yourself?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, my name is Maja Cepanec. I work at the University of Zagreb at the Department of Speech and Language Pathology. And clinically, I work at the Early Communication Unit, where I mostly do assessment of preschool children. Also, I'm doing research on early child communication. I'm the head of the Child Communication Research Lab. You can continue, Irene.
Okay, thank you. So thank you for completing the poll on autism. This was really just to start you thinking about some of your own knowledge. So have a quick look. People have answered some of the questions. Some of the questions are missing. So this is very interesting. If we can just end the poll at the moment, and then we'll go through some of the answers with you. Can we take the poll down, Evgenia? Thank you. So, autism is a result of emotional stress or emotional deprivation. This was a question. No, it's not. Associated with unusual responses to sensory stimulation. Yes, and I think most of you answered that. Autism is lifelong. Yes, it's a lifelong condition, although it may change as life goes on. Autism more likely in girls than in boys. No, it's more likely in boys. Some of the latest research shows around a 4:1 ratio. A withdrawal into fantasy life. It's not a withdrawal into fantasy life, although this is one of the myths that's around about autism. Autism is curable? No, but it does change over the lifespan. Autism is a spectrum disorder? Yes, and we will refer to it from now on as ASD, and Maya will speak a bit more about autism spectrum disorder. Autism is a new phenomenon. No, it's been around for a long time. Autism is genetic. It's possibly because it's linked to gender and it tends to run in families. All autistic children have special abilities? No, no they don't. And autism is a deliberate desire by a child to avoid social contact? No, it's not. So I'll give you some definitions of autism. ASD, so we'll refer to it as ASD. This definition is from the National Autistic Society in the UK, and it's a lifelong developmental disability that affects the way that a person communicates and relates to the people around them. This next definition is by a person who is affected by autism spectrum disorder, and she says it's a mysterious, unusual, potentially beautiful type of personality. To search the dictionary for a definition of autism is foolish. The definition will be incomplete and almost always negative. Autism was first discovered in the 1940s. There were two clinicians who were working with children who were affected by a range of behaviours that were unusual at the time. Kanner worked with 11 young children who had no verbal communication, and Asperger was working in Austria with 4 older young people who had extreme challenging behaviour, could be quite aggressive, ritualistic behaviours, but these young people were verbal. So these were the first two clinicians who worked with children and identified what was called autism or Asperger syndrome at the time, although these terms have changed, and Maya will speak a bit more about that.
So I will start with the first signs of autism spectrum disorders. Can you type in if you maybe have idea what would the first signs be, and at what age do parents notice something is going on and that their children are not behaving the same way as their peers? Do you have any idea, like when parents come to the assessment, what are the first sentences they say, like my child is doing something or not doing something we're supposed to see? So I hear 6 months. Well, one of the first things parents notice is that their child doesn't talk. So usually parents come to search for help during the 2nd year of life. That is the period when they notice something is going on. Then they notice that their child does not respond to the name. Sometimes they even wonder if their child is deaf. And some checklists for autism also include the item, have you ever thought that your child is deaf? But those children respond to the music or to some commercial music or something like that, but they do not respond to their name. Yes, Melissa is right, child seems distant, and that is what parents often say. My child does not communicate with me in a way that I think he or she should. She does not look at me that much, or does not show me things. So, and I have a sense that my child, if he or she communicates with me, the child only does it for me to get something for him, like to give him a ball or something like that, but does not show me a butterfly that he likes and so on. Also, parents notice that their child does not play as other children, or the child plays in a stereotyped way, like lining up toys, that the child does not imitate parents, or is not interested in a typical things like his or her peers, like in picture books. So there are some strange behaviors that parents also notice, like my child is flapping his hands, or is really selective when it comes to food, or cannot stand to be wet or something like that. There are some signs that are called red flags for autism, and these are the early signs of autism. Some of these signs are not specific to autism, but can be alarming, like at the age of 6 months when you don't see big smiles with gaze, or at the 12 months if a child does not respond to name or doesn't babble at the age of 12 months, or where you can not play catch ball with infant and toddler, and you don't see the development of gestures like pointing gestures, which is one of the most important ones. And if a child starts saying his first words after the age of 16 months, and also any loss of language or any loss of social skill is alarming at any age. So these red flags are some alarming signs both for parents, and it should also be alarming. It should also be alarming for pediatricians, and even more and more pediatricians are looking for those signs in infants and toddlers. A number of screening checklists for ASB have been developed in the last 20 years. Unfortunately, not all countries have systematic screening for autism. Most used checklist is modified checklist for autism in toddlers. It is used with toddlers aged 16 to 30 months, and it is also freely available on the internet. Now, do you have any idea why we should not look for autism signs or make autism diagnosis at the age of 9 months or 12 months? Do you have any idea why? Because sometimes parents see something is going on at the age of 6 months, at the age of 9 months, at the age of 11 months, but why the system is not going really to small infants? Okay, there can be other developmental challenges, not only related to autism. I agree. So the great jump in the communication development is happening in typical children between 9 and 18 months. So we expect a child at the age of 18 months to have some kind of nice communicative behavior, where we can diagnostically look for some things like, does he have a joint attention, does he respond in a certain way, does he use gestures, talks, and so on. So before the age of 18, it's quite hard to differentiate between typical and atypical communication development, because communication is still in the process of development. And that the other thing is that when we do screening for ASD at the age before 18 months or even before 16 months, we get a lot of false positive results because of the great individual differences that exist at that age. So one other point that I should make is that screening checklists are created in a way that the authors were thinking, well, we want to catch all the children with possible autism, and they have high sensitivity. It means that they will also catch some children who do not have autism or who have other developmental disabilities like intellectual disabilities, language disabilities, and so on. So if you give MCHAT screening, for example, to a whole population of children, 10% of the population will be positive, and we know that the prevalence of autism is not that high. So we should keep that in mind when doing screening process. Regarding the diagnosis itself, it should be said that there are no medical tests to diagnose autism. So that does not mean that your child will not be examined by a pediatrician or will not do some medical tests, but all these tests are just give additional information about the child's health and do not affect the way child behaves and whether those behavior meet the criteria for autism. So the diagnosis itself is based on the patterns of behavior and just on the patterns of behavior. There were some great historical changes in terminology and diagnostic criteria, both qualitative and quantitative changes. Like in the DSM-1, so the first diagnostic manual, it was called schizophrenic reactions, so it was called more like childhood schizophrenia, and then it turns to the pervasive developmental disorders, like the range of disorders, and now at the last diagnostic manual that was published 3 years ago, it all become one disorder, so autism spectrum disorder. That does not mean that all children with this disorder are the same, so it is quite a range of behavior. But why did it happen? Because it turns out that clinicians could not distinguish between subtypes of autism in a good way. So what are the diagnostic criteria for autism? There is so-called diagnostic criteria A and diagnostic criteria B, and the child or adult should fulfill all diagnostic criteria in A, so show deficit in social emotional reciprocity, in nonverbal communicative behavior. One of the most prominent signs is the eye contact, which is always impaired in children with autism, and deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So children with autism have less friends, they don't know how to make friends. Sometimes they even want to come to social community but don't have skills how to do it, don't understand how to do it. And the B part is about other behaviors, non-communicative behaviors, like stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech. There is a thing called echolalia, when a child repeats something he said, and is quite often present in ASD. The other criteria are like insistence and sameness, so children tend to show quite emotional reactions when something is not happening in a way it always is or they think that it should be. Then highly restricted interests, which are quite often in ASD, especially in previously called Asperger's syndrome. These children are interested in technical equipment really often. Does anyone have idea why technical equipment, why airplanes or trains or something like that, like mobile phones? No. Well, it seems that technical equipment is kind of predictive, and you press play, then it goes on, you press stop, and then it stops. So people don't act in the same way. People are really chaotic, and technical equipment is much better that way. And the new diagnostic criteria that entered DSM 3 years ago is something clinicians used to see often in children with ASD, is that they react in atypical ways sometimes, like an hyper or hyperreactive to sensory input, or have unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. Sometimes children will smell things or react unpredictably to loud sounds or to some colors and something like that. So if you have a child that has possible autism, you should do ASD assessment. It could be done in children between the ages of 24 and 30 months. That does not mean that that we cannot see signs of autism before that age, but it is wise not to do it before that, before the age of 2, because the reliability of diagnosis is lower if you do it under the age of 2. So there are some children who will show who will met criteria for ASD at the age of 2, but will not met those criteria at the age of 6. It is a small amount of children, I think around 10 to 15%, but these children still exist. Who will do the assessment? Multidisciplinary team that will use standardized tests and questionnaires and interview parents or friends or spouses, depends on the age of child or adolescent or adult. So it will be a normal developmental assessment with some special tests that are specific for the diagnosis of autism, like ADR and ADOS. In the southern and eastern Europe, there is a great problem with standardized tests because there is a lot of languages, a lot of states, and it all takes time and money to standardize those tests. So it is quite hard to make assessment if you do not have standardized tests. And sometimes, since the whole process of diagnosis of autism is complex and it takes time, sometimes ASD is misdiagnosed. It often happens when you look just at the one aspect of a child and not the whole picture, like if you were doing just how they behave or what is their language like or how do they pay attention and so on. So in children, ASD is sometimes misdiagnosed as ADHD or speech and language disorder or intellectual disabilities, although there is a lot of children who also have intellectual disabilities and autism spectrum disorder as well. In adolescents and adults, it is sometimes confused with schizophrenia, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and personality disorder. And now I'll pass back over to Irene, who will now talk about some of the theories about the underlying causes of the behaviors associated with ASD.
Irene, we cannot hear you. Could you please make sure your microphone is green?
Okay. Sorry about that. Thanks, Maya. So the first aspect of the behaviour of children and young people with ASD that I'd like to talk about is something called theory of mind. So theory of mind is our ability to understand the mental states of other people and how we use this understanding to explain and predict the actions of other people. So, for example, in usual types of development, as I am an adult, I can think about what someone's thinking about me. I can think about the way, for example, a conversation might go, what someone might think of what I may say. So you're placing yourself, if you like, almost in the other person's shoes, and you're able to relate to them as that other person and understand what they're thinking. So that's a very simple explanation of theory of mind. Children and young people affected by ASD have a poorly developed theory of mind, so they can't put themselves into another person's shoes. They can't predict how anything that they say or do might affect another person. So, just a quick question. If you were unable to put yourself in another person's shoes and unable to predict what the kind of things you said, the effect they would have on another person, how do you think that would affect your social relationships? Yeah, not very positively. Yeah, you would withdraw. Yes, if you thought that something you were saying or doing wasn't allowing you to take part in something. Yes. Your map of the world. That's a good way to put it. Yes. That's a really good way to put it. That people do have a map of the world. They have a map of relationships. They know how they fit in. Okay. So you can see why one of the deficits that are around for children and young people affected by ASD is this that lack of social reciprocity. So social relationships are extremely difficult. And one of the reasons behind this may be the poorly developed theory of mind. The next thing I'd like to talk about is central coherence. Now, everyone, again, in usual development, as they get older, develops central coherence. And central coherence means getting to the point or getting to the central meaning of things. It's the ability to pull together information from different sources and develop a high-level meaning. Once again, what we've found is that children and young people affected by ASD have weak central coherence. So they're good at attending to detail, but they're poor at seeing the overall patterns or meanings. So as an example of this, can I just ask a question? Why are you attending this webinar? Just get maybe a few answers. That might be quite nice. Learning about autism, how teachers can deal with children with autism. Supporting an NGO working with autism, right? Okay. Getting a better understanding of autism. So we have some higher level meanings here. So we have people are attending the webinar so that they can learn a bit about autism for whatever reason. Now, if a person affected by ASD was attending this webinar, they may set out to be looking at what autism is, but they may end up losing that point because they get lost in the detail. So they may end up attending to, for example, are all the font sizes the same? Are the colours the same between the slides? And this is a problem with central coherence. So what we're finding in some of the research is that children and young people with ASD lack central coherence and become very fixated on what seems to be not very relevant details. The third theory I'd like to talk about is executive function. And again, in normal development, people develop executive functions. Executive functions are things like attention, working memory, able to organise thoughts, forethought. So executive function means being able to focus and to hold and work with many different types of information in mind, to filter out any distractions and to switch gears if necessary, so that you can work, you can be reading things, someone can be talking to you, you can filter out anything that really doesn't matter when you're focusing on a particular piece of work that has to be done. One of the things that this has been called is the air traffic control system of the brain. Children and young people affected by ASD have weak executive function. So they have difficulties in attention, they have difficulties in forethought, poor working memory, which is where you hold all of the different bits of information. They have difficulty in organising and prioritising all the bits of information, and they have difficulty in impulse control. So, just another question. What possible distractions are there for you at this moment as you're sitting watching this webinar? If I can give you an example for me, I'm sitting in my office at the moment. There's a very loud clock that's ticking on the wall. There's also a light that's flickering above my head. So there are a few distractions there, but I'm able to tune them out because I'm talking to you. So what kind of distractions are there for you that you can, if you look around you, what are the kind of things that are happening in your environment? Oh, workers outside, yes. Maybe some noises from machines or shouting. Oh, students at the front door. Arriving emails pinging all the time. Colleagues in the room, your screen, noises in the street. If you start attending to these things, oh, a dog barking, very distracting. So you can see that there's actually a lot happening in the environment for anyone. And could you imagine what it would be like if you couldn't actually focus on the one thing that you have to do at that time? So, for example, if the dog starts barking, that's then what your attention goes to, and you can't concentrate on anything else. Or because your clock's ticking and you can't read because the clock's ticking, or you can't hear what a colleague says because there's a worker speaking outside. And these are the kinds of challenges that face children and young people who are affected by autism. So they can't filter out distractions, and it makes life very difficult. So just to sum up, weak central coherence, poor executive functioning, and a poorly developed theory of mind lead to major problems for children and young people understanding the world, being able to cope in the world, and being able to fit in. So some of the behaviour that you see in children and young people with autism, for example, Maya described the flapping behaviours, maybe rituals, routines. Other things might be self-injury. You know, children will maybe bite themselves or bang their heads. There's a number of things that, because of all of these difficulties that they have, these are ways of trying to cope. And so you can see when you look at these particular issues, that the reasons why does a child, for example, flap their hand in front of their face? It's just to get rid of all of the other distractions that are happening. Or why does a child perhaps have a ritual that they must do? It's because that's the one place where they feel safe. So just to continue on what it actually feels like to be affected by ASD. This is a quote, again, from the same woman, Jasmine Lee O'Neill, who's written a book about her ASD. And she says, many autistic people affectionately, humorously refer to themselves as aliens. They feel displaced on a vast planet which has a code of life and understanding they can't quite ever subscribe to. And I think that's a lovely quote because it describes, I think, very well what it must feel like to be a child or a young person affected by ASD. So a child or a young person affected by ASD would feel lost and confused. I think Judith said, they've lost their map of the world. Also, they're unable to let others know how they feel because there are communication difficulties. They're probably anxious and afraid all the time. I mean, if you could imagine that if you leave a room and you don't know what's waiting for you outside, or if you can imagine that when every time someone talks to you, you don't know if you're doing the right thing, or if you're acting the right way, you don't know how this person will react to you, and it would leave you highly anxious. And indeed, this is one of the things that's found about children and young people. And sometimes when you're anxious and afraid, you act in an aggressive way. You might scream, or you might self-harm. So a range of these behaviours are associated with anxiety. Another thing that Maya mentioned was about the routine behaviours. So again, just a very short question. Do you have routines? For example, I know one of my routines would be if I was going on a trip, I have to make sure, I maybe check that I have my passport about 3 or 4 times, and then I check it once again when I get to the airport. Another routine is perhaps making sure my door is locked when I leave the house, and maybe if I'm not sure I've locked it, go back and just make sure it's locked. Does anyone have routines? And have a think about how would you feel if you couldn't have your routine? If someone says, well, you actually can't do that anymore. I can see some people are typing. Good question about causing depression. Certainly autism, ASD and depression are comorbid, particularly in adolescents. So it's maybe not so much about causing depression, but it must be a great challenge to adults and to adolescents when they're faced with this anxiety all of the time. And articulate young people affected by ASD do talk about the fact that this does make them feel depressed. So, yeah, routines make you feel more comfortable. You have to make sure your stove is off before you leave home. And if you're not sure, you have to go back and check, yes. And if you couldn't go back and check, you would probably feel quite anxious, I would imagine. Can't imagine life without daily routines. Yeah. Routines are important for everyone. They are a source of comfort, and they're often a source of just how we control anxiety. And if you think that children and young people affected by ASD are anxious all the time, then it becomes easier to understand why they have their routines. Okay, so we'll maybe go on. Maya and I spoke about the integration of children with ASD. One of the issues that's around for the integration of ASD is thinking that, and along the lines of what's called the medical model of disability. And this is where the child or young person is always seen as the problem. And as you can see in this diagram, the traditional view is that the disability is caused by some kind of medical condition or impairment. The individual is impaired, so it's the individual that's the problem. And the focus of the medical profession or any professions is to alleviate the effects of the problem or to cure the problem. But in actual fact, one of the issues that's around is that it's not always the person that causes the difficulty. And we're coming more and more towards thinking of a social model of disability. So in the social model of disability, the person who is affected faces barriers in society. And again, as you can see in this diagram, there's a range of barriers. So for example, the environment might be inaccessible. There might not be the right kind of language or communication to help a person to fit into their community or their society. There might be poor attitudes, prejudice against a person who's affected by ASD. There may be stereotypes and discrimination, which mean that a person isn't accepted into their community. And some organisations can be fairly inflexible when it comes to working with anyone with any kind of disability. And if they have the wrong kinds of procedures and practices, then it may mean that person cannot get access to the kinds of services that they need. So our suggestion would be that we don't focus so much on the child or young person with ASD, but we focus on how can the community and how can society help that young person to fit in. So we'll go over some helpful hints in terms of some of the main criteria for diagnosis in ASD. First point is to remember that the child may be unsure of what's expected of him or her in social reaction. You'll remember that when we spoke about theory of mind, that the child has great difficulty in social reciprocity. Also, they may be very frightened of new or unpredictable experiences. So try and have, if you're working in an organisation, try and have as few members of staff as possible working with the child. Also, ensure that the parents and staff know about the particular rituals and sensory issues affecting the child. So if the child has a routine, make sure people know about that. And you can use routines as a way to comfort a child if you build them into their daily routine, their daily timetable. Also, Maya mentioned sensory issues. This is very important because if a child has, say, hypersensitivity of hearing, it means that maybe a small clock ticking in a room might sound like someone banging a drum to that child. So you might want to use ear defenders for the child so that it reduces their hypersensitivity to hearing. Keep the interactions at low key. So don't do anything loud, don't do anything surprising. Just stay calm when you're interacting with the child. And if you're introducing the child to new situations, do that gradually. In terms of their imagination, their flexibility of thought, where we were talking about some rigidity in relation to their maybe central coherence or routines, just remember, how would you feel if you didn't know what was going to happen all the time? You would be terrified. And that's what the world's like for a child or young person affected by ASD all the time. So develop clear visual timetables to help them understand what will be happening next and to prepare them for this. And Maya has put an example at the bottom of the slide of a morning schedule. So in this schedule, the child would have a diagram where first they have circle time, then they have a snack, and then they have reading. And they have small symbols to represent that. So the child knows in a very visual way what's happening, one task at a time. And only present one task at a time. You know, don't try and do 2 or 3 things or give lots of choice, because that's not helpful for a child affected by ASD. And provide concrete markers that the task is ending and a new one is beginning. So using the visual timetable is a very good way to do that. And these are used quite regularly, certainly in the UK. And also keep your language simple, clear and concrete. So try not to say a lot of words to a child affected by ASD. Just try to keep your language maybe to two or three short words, sentences. In terms of communication, again, just a few hints. Make sure that you've got a clear and simple communication system. Remember, the child can be helped by concrete markers like objects of reference, diaries, pictures, symbols, anything that's outside that you can use to help the child to understand what's happening. Make sure all staff and family members are aware of communication difficulties and use the same strategies to help with this. So, for example, if you're using a visual timetable at school, use a visual timetable at home as well. You can do exactly the same strategy at home. And again, above all, be consistent, clear and unambiguous in your communication. If any of you are currently working with children affected by ASD, do you use any particular communication systems with them that have been helpful? Someone's typing just now. Pictograms, yes, the visual timetables in the NGO. Yes, they're very effective. They've been shown to be extremely helpful, and they are something that they can change as life goes on, as a child gets older. But they always give that visual support to communication. Weekly and daily agendas, yes, and depending on how badly affected the child is, you might even have an agenda that's an hour by hour agenda, or you may have a morning routine, the getting up out of bed, getting dressed routine. Just depends on what the issues are, but there are many different kinds of visual support you can use. So it's nice to see that these strategies are being used. So just to finish off, at the beginning we spoke about the two clinicians who identified ASD in the 1940s. This is a picture of one of the children that Leo Kanner worked with. Now, Kanner was working in published his paper in 1942 or 43. This is Donald, who was the first child who was identified in Kanner's paper. So he was the first child who was diagnosed with autism, if you like. He had extreme behaviours when he was a baby, and his parents were advised to put him into an institution. So this was in late 1930s. So the parents put the child into an institution, and he stayed there for a year. But after a year, the parents took the child out of the institution because they just couldn't bear to leave him there, and they didn't feel that the institution was doing anything for him. They then took him to Kanner, and Kanner identified what was happening with the child. The child was raised in his family and stayed within his local community. And this is Donald now. Donald's 82. So the first child who was diagnosed with autism back in the 40s is still alive. On the picture on your left is Donald with two people who are writing a book about Donald. And on the right is a picture of Donald with his brother. Donald still lives in his community, still affected by ASD. His ASD has changed over the years, but because he was accepted into his community and supported in his family, Donald has lived a very fulfilling life. So we thought we'd maybe like to let you just see that kind of historic part about autism. So any questions?
I noticed one question and I didn't answer it. So somebody asked about the prevalence. I mentioned 1 in 100. So the prevalence has changed a lot during the last 10-20 years. So somebody was wondering where did I get this information from. So Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported 2 years ago, so these are the data from the United States of America, that 1 in 68 children, these are the data from 8-year-olds, so 1 in 68 children has ASD, and that means 1 in 42 boys and 1 in 189 girls.
Okay.
Nobody knows why this prevalence is changing, but we can talk about it.
Okay. I'm seeing a question from Evgenia about, do people have ASD have professions and families? ASD is a spectrum disorder, so it means that sometimes people are so badly affected by ASD that they need a huge amount of support all of their lives. But some people are not so badly affected by ASD. So there are indeed people who have professions and jobs. It tends to run in families, so you might see, for example, when I worked in the residential school, it was quite clear that some of the parents of the children with whom we worked were on the autistic spectrum. You could tell from their behaviour. But there are people with ASD who have families and have jobs. I think one of the things that Maya said earlier on was that everyone with ASD is different, and we shouldn't stereotype, and that there's, as long as a person is given the right kind of support, they can live a fulfilled life.
Vyacheslav was asking about, is it true that in the future there will be 6 to 10% diagnosed with ASD? Well, nobody really knows what is going to happen, but it is true that the prevalence changed a lot. I don't think that will ever be 1 in 10, because then we are kind of wondering what is normal and what is not. So one of the diagnostic criteria is that your communication and other problems affect the way you live. So sometimes it is forgotten during the diagnostic process, when you only see, do you look at each other, how you communicate, do you like your routines, and so on. But when you have ASD diagnosis, it means that those kind of behaviors and the way you process social information affects your life in a way that you cannot live in the same way as people who do not have ASD. So it's a diagnosis. It's not, I have a little bit problem with people, or I'm shy or something like that. It's like a serious condition that affects the way you live in a social world.
I'm seeing a question here about, in terms of therapy, what works. I know animal therapy does. They learn to relate to others better. There are a range of interventions and therapies that are around. And again, I think because children and young people and adults with ASD are so different, some things will work with some people and some things won't. There's one of the autism-specific units in Scotland that we have has a range of therapies. So they have animal therapy, they have art therapy, where children will work with an artist and make art. There's music therapy, which helps some children. There's play therapy. There's a range of different therapies which, just depending on the needs of the child, can be very, very helpful. And I think the more of these therapies that we have, then the better. In terms of a therapy curing a child or young person, that wouldn't be the case, but it might help alleviate some of the symptoms, or help to make some of the behaviours more manageable.
Well, I'd like to add something to that, because there are a lot of therapies on the market that are not evidence-based, and so parents and professionals should keep in mind that not everything that is offered for children or adults with autism has a background, and not everything has any kind of theoretical or practical sense. So we should be cautious. Parents and professionals should be cautious when talking about therapies, because some miracle therapies that are on the market are not so.
I'm looking, once ASD is diagnosed, what are some of the treatments? Well, I would say that, and Maya might want to chip in on this, but I would say that once ASD is diagnosed, you're really looking at helping the child or young person to cope with some of the behaviours. So there's a number of interventions that can be used. For example, using what's called the TEACH system. Some people use applied behavioural analysis, intensive interactions, so that there's a number of, I suppose, interventions that can be used. But in terms of medical treatments, one of the problems that has emerged is that very often children who are affected by ASD are prescribed a variety of drugs, for example, Ritalin, and again, I think that it's because of this, the emphasis on the medical model, where you think, well, the child has this condition, so there must be a drug that will help. I mean, and there's no doubt also that a number of children affected by ASD have comorbid conditions. So I think some of the research shows that around about 70% of children might be affected by other conditions alongside ASD. It may be that there are treatments for some of those. But I think if you look at interventions for ASD, you're really looking at ways in which the behaviour can be, the behaviours and the symptoms can be alleviated. I don't know if Maya's got anything to add to that.
Well, I would like to add just a little point, because Melissa asked, once ASD is diagnosed, what are some of the treatments? Where the truth is, you don't have to diagnose ASD to start a treatment. So the early intervention is focused on when you see your child has a problem, you have a treatment for that problem. So if you see your child has communication problems, you start doing intervention that will focus on the communication skills. So you don't need to wait. The diagnosis per se has some administrative function and so on, I know, for insurance and other things, but for the start of the treatment you really do not have to wait for the diagnosis, because sometimes it takes months or even years to get a diagnosis.
Okay. I'm seeing another question. People with ASD need lifelong assistance. Can they live alone? What I would say, again, as Maya said, ASD is a lifelong developmental condition. So although ASD lasts for the lifespan, it can change, and often does change over the course of the lifespan. And it might be, if a person is very badly affected by ASD, they may need lifelong support. They may need to live with their family or in some kind of supported accommodation for all of their lives. But again, there are some people where they're maybe not so badly affected and they can live without support. There may be people where it changes. For example, Donald, the picture that I showed you before, Donald ended up he lives in his own house. He's in a very supportive community where everyone knows him. He has family around him, but he lives in a house on his own. And I think as long as interventions and supports are put in place, I think the key is to help the person to reach their potential, whatever that potential is. I don't know if you have anything to add.
I just want to add that the level of support will be different based on the intellectual abilities. So there are people with autism who have average or above average intelligence, and they will statistically need less help during their lives than children or adults who have ASD but also have comorbid intellectual disabilities. So that's like statistically that's the case. That does not mean that it is true in every case, because ASD symptoms can also be really, really difficult for some people who also have high intellectual status, but more or less that's the case. And we see Vyacheslav. Does it true that some persons with ASD have very high IQ? Well, yes, those people are called used to be called Asperger's syndrome or high functioning autism. So children and people with low functioning autism are the ones who have above average intelligence and IQs. And some children and some persons with autism have very
Judith saying about Asperger. I think, as Maya explained, it used to be that there were different names for the different sort of autistic disorders, if you like. So Asperger's syndrome was one of the disorders, and it was associated with people who were certainly they were verbal, who also had sort of ritualistic behaviours. But when they redid the DSM, they decided they did away with the term Asperger's syndrome. So, and now the diagnostic criteria are, as Maya pointed out earlier, so you have the 3 sort of main criteria and then a range of other criteria. And all of to get a diagnosis of ASD, you have to meet it's the first 3 criteria, isn't it, Maya? In that particular slide. So things have changed a little bit since the new DSM was published. Are there any other questions?
Thank you very much, Irene and Maya. I think we had a very interesting discussion. Thank you for your active participation, and could you kindly please answer the poll that you can see on your screen now? Also, if you want to have a certificate confirming that you took part in this webinar, please feel free to email us. I will ask my colleague Judith if you could. Can you please type the email in the chat box so you can send us an email asking for a certificate confirming your attendance. And also please keep an eye on our website, and especially with the webinars section. We are going to have many more interesting webinars in the future. Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you very much, Maya and Irene, and I wish you a wonderful day and a lovely weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.